Ultimately, the real implications of our fractured world is a fracturing in our communities. And this is a really important aspect for all of us to be speaking about. So we're delighted to have an amazing panel with us here this morning to discuss fractured communities with Irish Times journalist Sorcha Pollak. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone. Are we all ready to begin? Will I whistle? Great stuff. Thank you all for being here this morning. I know we're following quite an act after that constitutional chat this morning, which was fascinating. Thanks to Rowan and the whole panel. We are coming to you with quite a broad conversation, and I'm really glad to say that we have a 50-50 panel today, in that we've got 50% north, 50% south of the border. Which will make it a really varied and important discussion about what fractured communities means in the Republic and in Northern Ireland in 2025. So I'm going to just give a brief introduction. A lot of you will know some of our panellists very well, but I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then I'm going to ask them to very briefly, and I underline briefly, just talk about what the term fractured communities means to them. So on my far right, I have Gary Gannon. He is a TD representing Dublin's North Inner City, and he's the Social Democrat spokesperson for Justice, Home Affairs and Migration. Gary served as a Dublin City Councillor from 2014 to 2020, and he was elected to the Dáil in 2020. Gary's political work focuses on pursuing equality of opportunity in education, the provision of adequate services for more marginalised communities, and the rejuvenation of our capital city. Directly to my right here, it's my real pleasure to introduce Claire Hanna, who is the leader of the SDLP and MP for Belfast South and Mid Down. Claire was born in Connemara but has lived in Belfast since she was 3 years old, and before she entered politics she worked in international development in places like Haiti, Zambia and Bangladesh, and her passion for international development and humanitarian affairs has continued to inform much of her political work. She was elected as a councillor to Belfast City Council in 2011, elected to Parliament in 2019, and she succeeded Colm Eastwood as the leader of the SDLP last October in 2024. To my left here, I have Lata Sharma. Lata was born and raised in Northern Ireland, and she is of Indian heritage. She is a TV and radio presenter, actor, writer, performer, and community advocate. So you cover all bases, Lata. And this evening, you're also all going to hear more from Lata because she's going to present her one-woman show, Sausage Sodas and Onion Badgies, about the life of a teenage Indian girl born at the start of the Troubles and reared in East Belfast. And I'm really disappointed that I unfortunately have to miss this because I have to get back to Dublin, but I would encourage everyone to go along and enjoy that performance. And to my far left is David Higgins, economist. David is an economist and co-host of the Next Round podcast. He specifically asked I mention his podcast, so there you go, David. He is the former chief economist with the Carrigahill research provider. He's now self-employed. He's a regular contributor to the Brendan O'Connor show on RT Radio 1 and also writes regularly in the Irish Independent. So what we're doing here today is we're taking the theme of this entire summer school, A Fractured World, and we're making it local. We're talking about fractured communities. And as you can see from our panel, we have 4 people with vast experience in Irish politics, north and south of the border, so we have plenty to discuss. So I wanted to open by asking each of our panellists to briefly just explain to the audience what the term fractured communities means to them. So Gary, I'm going to open with you and ask you, can you just tell us what a fractured community means to you?
Yeah, thanks, Sorcha, and thank you for the invitation. It's absolutely wonderful to be back up in the Glenties. The idea of a fractured community to me it's a challenging concept, because when people think of what constitutes, a disconnected community, oftentimes the imagery in your mind is, it's predominantly, or certainly down in Dublin or in the south, it's going to be, the moment you're going to be thinking of is somebody with a says no sign in their hand. You're going to be thinking of protest and anger and agitation, and the anger being, what I would argue, being misplaced and misdirected. But for the same people who would say Ireland is full, I mean, for me, it's not. But the communities have been running on empty. They're drained. The same communities that you're thinking of there, who are the ones who've always been accepting, have always had people from different communities come in and be the first to open the doors. But they're also the communities probably are the least, probably in a lot of ways, the least privileged, but also asked being to do the most. And communities that have stood up for so long and are now running on empty. And the idea of what steps into that zone is misinformation. We're living in an online world where people who are drained of time, they're probably living in overcrowded accommodation, have children in schools where you can't access provision of special education. And into that zone comes misinformation, fear, to told somebody else is a target rather than kind of a lack of provision or a government not taking an interest for decades. And those communities, the idea that they're being disconnected, for me, is also that they've been let go. And it's how we bring them back, and how we bring communities back. And I've made this mistake too often, is where you speak first and don't listen. You listen, and behind the fear, behind the placards, you hear the fear of being further left behind, further marginalised, further asked to go without. And I think leadership is how we listen, and how we act, and how we try to meet people where they are, and acknowledge what they're being asked to go without, and then step into that zone is where political leadership can actually demonstrate where we can bring back disconnected communities.
Thanks, Gary. Claire, Hanna?
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here as well. Yes, we were talking about how you could take many different interpretations from the topic, but I suppose I wanted to give a northern perspective on it, and I suppose some of the factors and dynamics that Gary's talking about, but an even broader sense of political disempowerment in the north that I think comes from the stop-start nature of government, the fact that for years at a time there is no government, there's nobody in charge, there's nobody driving the ship, and there doesn't seem to be particularly straight lines between your vote and stuff happening. Politicians are rewarded for not actually delivering for you, and we don't tend to do the boring governance bit in between our very frequent elections. And I suppose while huge strides, obviously, in the post-agreement years, and lots of people live in good lives and post-sectarian lives, quite clearly communities are still fractured apart from one another, and there's separation in schools and in housing, in sports. We've just a very topical story this week. And in many communities, that is very visually illustrated with, flags and murals and all of that. And there is a sense that while people are redefining their own identity in very positive ways, politics isn't always catching up. Then on the top of that, ethnic minorities and newcomers, for want of a better word, and I know how flawed that is, are having to navigate around those fractures. It's a society that has been set up to deal with a binary, and people are trying to find a place and trying to find resources. And I'll give you one example. In my constituency, which I'd say is probably the most diverse on the island of Ireland in every sense, two local primary schools, Holy Rosary Primary School and Fane Street Primary School, are both dealing, or when I say dealing, they have newcomer children are about 70% of their enrolment, but they'd be defined as, well, they're sectarian schools. That's a Catholic school and a Protestant school. You need to go to this integrated school that has 50% Catholics and 50% Protestants, and they don't get the same level of funding despite the complexity of the fractures they're dealing with. And I suppose that manifests in the worst ways in some of the very violent racism that we've experienced in my constituency last August and in Ballymena last month, and we might talk a little bit more about it. But that fracture, as the fracture in the north was for decades, is just the failure of some people to tolerate and accept difference in any way, and that has now spilled into racism. So just in finishing then, from the SDLP's perspective, it's quite clear to us that there are three key fractures, key fault lines in politics, and you can't deal with one of them without dealing with the others. They are division in the form of sectarianism and now racism, division in the economy and just it working for some people and not, and division in terms of the border on the island that is limiting the potential of the north and its people.
Thanks, Claire, and all of those elements will be feeding into our discussion for sure. Lata, would you like to tell us what the term fractured communities means to you?
Fractured communities is something that I have grown up with my whole life, being born and reared in Northern Ireland. So, and sadly, our two communities back home who are still living with the legacy of the Troubles, still suffering economically, socially, mentally, economically. And it tends to be obviously people within the working class communities that I feel the most sort of sorrow for, because they have had a lot to deal with. And our society in Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, I have to say, has not had a lot of experience of people from different cultures coming onto this island. So their inexperience of dealing with that then triggers a sense of fear, which has come about from, having 24-hour media, social media. All of these things are now something that we have access to, and we see all these things going on around the world, all these fractured societies around the world, and we see trauma and more trauma sort of maybe coming to these shores too, and that causes even further discord and fracturing and fear. And for me, as someone who was born and reared at the start of the Troubles and grew up throughout it with communities and my peers from both sides of the community, I feel a sense of duty to them, to speak for them, to hear them, and understand that when people aren't given, when they're not given that sense of respect for concerns, that fear and that discord and fracturing happens to an even greater extent. And I think personally the media, the political classes and the academic classes, through all their good intentions of trying to do the best for everyone, have inadvertently caused more fracturing than what they intended to do. I'm sure they never intended it at all, but it has resulted in more fracturing because of their unwillingness to listen to voices who are maybe a little bit more measured from all of those communities, be they green and orange, be they ethnic minorities, and that has created more discord and fracturing. And I look forward to getting stuck into that a bit later on.
Thanks, Lata. And finally, David, would you like to share your thoughts?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. First time being on a panel at MacGill, so thank you for the hospitality. The two areas of discord that I've picked young people in Ireland today, and I've picked, I suppose, our island at large. And I've picked things that I see some good and some discord in. So within young people, young adults today in Ireland, there are things that are going very much in their favour. Unemployment is low, education levels are high, the ability to go and travel and see the world is very much there. But I think the discord arises from things like access to housing, which has gone much later in life, but also access to other life milestones. I identify marriage and family, things that used to be in the mid-20s are now very much in the mid-30s. That I call this an umbrella term, the milestone recession, that these milestones have been pushed later and some people miss out on them entirely. And I think that causes significant discord. The second topic that I picked was really the population of the island at large. We are now jointly, Northern Ireland and the Republic, population of 7 million. We hit that in 2022. And 1.5 million of that is just additional in the past 20 years. We're adding about an extra Donegal to the population every 2 years. But with that has come a great challenge of being able to manage that. It almost comes back again to housing, but things like transport capacity, health, crime and justice, water, electricity, all of these services have had to run to stand still. And I think there has been a discord that has gone along with that.
Thank you, David. So before today's panel, I contacted all our panellists and asked them just to send me some notes on today's discussion. And for me, there were three distinct groups that emerged that I'd like to talk through this morning. So for what we're going to look at is we're going to look at how these fractures have emerged in working class communities, immigrant communities and youth communities. These are all intertwined, of course, but we're going to go with those headings. So I'd like to start with immigrant communities. For those of you who were here last night, there was a very interesting comment made towards the end of the discussion on Sam McBride's discussion with Sarah Carey on the United Ireland for and against, was that the migrant population in Northern Ireland are going to play an important role if and when this border poll happens. And understanding, hearing, integrating the voices of the migrant population is very important for this entire island. this island has rapidly changed. As David has referenced, we're having a migration boom. We're changing demographic. There are positives, there are negatives. But there is definitely a lack of understanding around why migration is happening, who these varied people are coming from all corners of the earth. And as a result, this is causing discontent, distrust, and in some cases fear. So, Gary, I'd like to go to you first on that, and why you think this appears to be getting worse rather than getting better in many regards.
I mean, very bluntly, people's lives are getting worse rather than better, and because we are a very wealthy country, but it's very difficult to tell that to people who are living in extreme poverty, when they're not seeing it in their cupboards, they're not seeing it in their access to housing, they're not seeing it in their child's education. All of that leads to scenarios where things are getting worse, and then you have algorithms on social media that when you're logging on in the brief 40 seconds you have in the day where you're being told who to blame for that is. And it's a person who doesn't look like you, doesn't come from where you're coming from, and you're being told that person is taking the very little that you have. So, I mean, it's an absolute melting cauldron of factors, but there are people taking advantage of that. But then when you speak about, and I'm certainly not someone that can speak as kind of about the migrant population, but what I do see in Dublin City is, I mean, there's no one homogenous migrant population. And I mean, when we talk about increases in populations and what the strain that presses on services, we also have to acknowledge that a lot of our services are held up by migrants who've come here and staffed their hospitals and work in jobs all over this country, and that needs to be recognised. We've also have people who've just come here and contributed through their culture. But we do have a scenario where the access to provision of basic services, basic dignity. And I mean, when you think of dignity, you have to imagine a person in an overcrowded accommodation that probably has 3 to 4 even generations of people living in under the one roof. Can you imagine the erosion that has on a person's mental health? Can you imagine then when you have a generational trauma and finally your child gets a diagnosis of ADHD or whatever it may be, and you don't have access to a service, you don't have access to speech and language therapy, you don't have access. And access is so fundamentally important. And into that, rumours abound that this other group have better access to a doctor. They've got, they're getting car payments, and they're coming here and being handed out everything. And it's too difficult, like, for people who are time poor to go and actually have to challenge that, because they're trying to put food on their table, quite literally. But into that space, misinformation abounds, and then you get what it's all because it's a contest of provision, and the contest of just basic access to provision is what's fostering that discord within communities. But within that, this is not just a big, large belief system either. Just to be clear, this is like kind of, I represent Dublin Central, which has the North Inner City. I mean, this is not the vast swathes of people. We're not standing outside any buildings with placards. Far more people were involved in kind of welcome groups. Far more people were just getting on with their lives. But there is a small, we do have over-focus on kind of when that discord erupts, for good reason. I mean, it's horrible and it's interesting and it will take news. But we also have to acknowledge where that stems from, how we confront it, go beyond the placard and hear the ask, hear what they're actually fearful of, and then we're just getting into basic absence of essential things. And if we tackle that, well, then actually we get to heal the disconnect. But the first thing we have to do, and look, I've failed so many times in this. When the first protests against migrants IPAS Centre happened in East Wall, if you remember, a couple of years ago, I was the first one onto my social media pages saying, this is terrible, there's children in that building, get away. And you know what, by the time I'd finished those social media posts, the communities that I grew up in, that I lived in, where my family still are now, and I still am, I'd already lost them. And it took years to get that back, of actually just knocking at doors and going beyond the placard, hearing the fear, and actually talking, and knowing that actually one of the things that break it down, it's not only political leadership, it's actually just access to the people. You know, somebody who you're so afraid of, you heard about like men of military age, now all of a sudden those same lads are saying on the same football team. You know, that way it's time, it's space, it's understanding, it's listening, but that also doesn't absolve the state of its responsibility to provide.
I was invited last year, fortunately, to discuss a topic around immigration, and we spoke very soon after the Pollak protest and riots. And this year, we're speaking very soon after what happened in Ballymena in June. And I know, Claire, Hanna, that you were very vocal about what happened there. I should say it struck me personally because my own grandfather went to Ballymena as a political refugee in 1948. So seeing this town that welcomed that part of my family turn it really struck me. But when this happened, you described what happened as a race-based pogrom, and the fact that people were going door to door attacking families. What did that say about the discord that Gary's referenced that now exists in Northern Ireland?
So I agree with everything Gary said there about some of it being rooted in genuinely people's sense of disempowerment and lack of control and lack of resources in their own lives, and the algorithm issue as well, because there is a memification of politics everywhere. We saw last week, everybody saw that image of the Stop the Boats topper on the Moygashel bonfire. That's a Farage meme. Nobody's coming by boat to Northern Ireland, and certainly nobody's going to Donegal by boat. You know, it's entirely landlocked, but it is just picking up the politics in fragment. And effectively, there's a call and response type politics where, you know, you say there's small boats, you know, people are just repeating. But some of it, yes, is rooted in that same sense of dislocation, and was in Ballymena. That had been a fairly prosperous town with ready access to, you know, what we'd call breadwinner jobs, and jobs that didn't maybe require a formal education. And there is definitely a dislocation from people and communities who would have had those jobs in previous generations and not had them. Again, statistics came out fairly quickly that showed there were 0 asylum seekers in the council area affected. Yes, there are people of different backgrounds, and yes, they probably were very concentrated in a few small streets, but it is a lack of exactly the leadership that Gary refers to. It is very, very easy for politicians to say, yep, the reason you're not being able to get a house isn't because we have failed to invest. And again, you know, the housing waiting lists in the north would make Dublin blush, let me tell you, and there's less chat about it, but that it isn't because we've failed to invest in housing. We failed to actually form a government for years that would do those things. It's because of these newcomers, and it is a failure to break down. We hear all the time, you know, that we're not allowed to talk about immigration. I'm never done on TV programmes and in debates and in things like this talking about immigration. And the statistics are very stark. 1 in 5 healthcare workers are from another country. Queen's University in Ulster are very, very clear that their business models are not sustainable without overseas students. But again, that lack of, I suppose, on-the-ground political leadership, there is definitely, I'm sorry to say, there is a definite paramilitary factor. I was very aware of it in Ballymena. I was very, very aware of it in Sandy Row and Beaver and parts of my own constituency, where for 2 or 3 years we've been, you know, drawing attention to, you know, organised posters going up talking about what landlords should and shouldn't be doing. You know, local community groups don't have the resources to print banners and Fomex posters saying this is coming from organised groups, and it's coming from paramilitaries who I suppose are both, you know, experienced in dealing in fear and division, and who probably have anxieties about other, rooted in that inability to accept difference, but they probably know that, you know, wrapping the flag around you doesn't cut mustard with, say, somebody from Bangladesh who doesn't really care which flavour of paramilitary you are. So if you're not hearing on the ground and in, I suppose, the air war, if you're not hearing messages that contradict and give a fairer analysis, it's understandable that people are going to be swept along with it.
Lata, how does it feel for you sitting listening to this discussion as someone who grew up in Northern Ireland in the 70s, 80s, 90s, at a time where you were either green or orange and being different was just not even considered, and now there is this discussion and this debate about the migrant community, a community that you were part of before people even realised it was there?
Okay, so I've always been very proud to have been born and raised in Northern Ireland, and growing up during those times, we were a tiny community. You didn't even see brown faces. There were so few of us. And that was one of the reasons, of course, why you didn't get a lot of immigrants coming to Northern Ireland, or Ireland for that matter. And they tended to go to England and Scotland and Wales. And my experience, I suppose, is that because I grew up navigating the sectarianism and the sort of the bit of racism that you got, I became very immersed in our society and understood the green and orange politics in a way that I fear that the new communities could be manipulated by our politicians. And when I see politicians in Northern Ireland, or indeed, down south or across the water, I kind of wonder what they're not learning. What are they not seeing that I'm seeing? And each time I hear you all talk, and even just today, I get frustrated because it's not complicated. You have made it complicated. You have decided that you didn't want to. You thought that to make an immigrant feel welcome, you had to demonise your own communities. Now that may not have come, I can't speak for you, but in Northern Ireland and in England, in Westminster, I have seen how working class communities who don't verbalise things the way, a politician does. They don't say things in a politically correct vocabulary. We talk in colloquialisms and, we say things very directly, but we're not always coming from a bad place. And I think sometimes when I hear people in the political media and, academic classes talking about the working class communities, you have an incredible sympathy, and you're there to try and do a job. You're there to try and make sure they get housing, try and make sure they get, a dental appointment or a doctor's appointment, try and get places into school. That is all exactly what you're supposed to do. But where I think you feel, is in the emotion. You're not sensitive to people's feelings. You're not sensitive to your own people's feelings about something that everybody's very uncomfortable with talking about. Difference, cultural differences, cultural clashes. Societies where, things are very different from where they come from to where we come from. And when I saw what happened in Ballymena, and even the race riots from last August, it broke my heart, because I know the vast majority of working class people are decent people. I grew up with these people. I went to school with these people. I have a great, great respect for the suffering that they went through during the Troubles. And they are not given that grace by our politicians. When they speak, they sort of demonise without thinking. Within the media, they do it as well. And I find myself feeling very, very hurt for them, because I know the vast majority are not bad people. Even the ones who may come out and express a sense of anger. And I'll tell you one particular incident that really struck me was when a Radio Ulster DJ, not a DJ, a Radio Ulster presenter went down the Sandy Row, and he decided he was going to interview this gentleman who was scowling. The riots had happened around that area, and across the road from where he was standing with the presenter, there was a gentleman whose shop had been completely trashed. And inside that shop, I know that there were loyalist people in the shop helping to tidy up that shop, while politicians were outside getting their photograph taken. But the media focused on the politicians. They didn't bother to go in and have a wee look. And the man who was being interviewed by the presenter was being scowled at and humiliated, and I thought, you're not doing me any favours. You're not doing me any favours. You're creating more racism by thinking that by humiliating this man in a public forum is going to make my life any better in the society that I love. Because when you might as well, you just entrenched him further into hating people who are different. And that is not the way to navigate these things.
Yeah, Claire, of course, yeah.
I think, and genuinely throughout the last couple of years in sport, you do try to contextualise the challenge. I do think you have to differentiate. I think everybody in the North saw that interview. It was Nolan, and it was very difficult to watch because he interviewed this guy for about 10 minutes, and the guy said, no, the guy shouldn't be in this country. He shouldn't be running a supermarket. So I don't care if a supermarket.
But he kept saying, "Do you not care? Do you not care?"
He was genuinely at the very extreme end of racism, and similarly.
No, but hold on.
But no. Can I just differentiate?
Yeah.
Literally, Lata. I mean, I think because I absolutely. You can't say to people, "You're all big, thick ignorance," and sure, you've got no grievance. Because of course, I spend my, we lead the opposition. I spend my working day saying the people of Northern Ireland are being let down in the failure to provide them with decent public services. I have huge sympathy for that.
Yeah.
But we also both heard audio, and I was in Ballymena, and literally people saying, if there's foreigners in that house, burn it out.
Yes, I did hear that.
There's no compassion there. And I think you can differentiate, without demonising working class communities, and I know because I'd worked for a long time before those riots last year. I'd worked with the Sandy Row traders, and they are unfortunately split into the minority ethnic and the longer term resident traders. So I know exactly who was kind of supporting who, but I do think when it is naked hatred and literally, and I use the word pogrom because literally groups of people were going, this house has foreigners in it, breaking the window and burning it. That's not, I don't think you can be compassionate about that.
I'm not.
I think you have to be very explicit about that.
I'm not being compassionate about it, Claire.
I want to move this on because there is a parallel to the Republic in this as well, and I want to bring Gary back in. And David, I will come back to you, apologies, because I know that there was a reference that Lata made to politicians coming into communities and speaking about the need for health, for education, better infrastructure, but not fully understanding. So Gary, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that with regards to Dublin and North Inner City, because for anyone in the room who doesn't know, there has been a lot of pushback in the North Inner City towards immigration.
Yeah, there's been pushback against immigration. Not so much immigration. It was the immigration and the spike that came about 2 years ago, that when international protection centres were being opened up, and then some communities and some portions of communities absolutely came out and were protesting outside centres, would have made the news. And I suppose one of the things, so when Lata was talking about politicians not saying the right things or not anything, that's absolutely fine. But do you know how easy it would be to say nothing? To actually do what a lot of other politicians show up, actually sit on the fence, say, well, on one side there is this view, but on the other side this. I think when people are being attacked, and vulnerable people are being attacked, it's very difficult to get the right words for that. I mean, my own mother lives in the North Inner City. She's a working class woman, works in Charlotte Street, street trader. About a month ago, a rumour went around about an international protection office, a centre opened up around the corner, purposely started by far-right agitators. And there was a march of about 100 people, some of whom were neighbours, just marched by our house just to be intimidating. So, I mean, the stakes are, we don't operate out in the ether. Like, we're people who have emotions, we're political representatives. We want to get the words right. But that does also this was all new to a lot of us too. That's why my contribution started off with by not coming in and listening more, kind of hearing the voices, going beyond it. I think a lot of us are getting to that point. We required a lot more state intervention. We required a lot more understanding. Even recently, in terms of there's been increased deportations of children in the Republic. And I mean, there wasn't very many voices actually going out onto the radio and saying, maybe we don't have to deport children. Maybe children who are in their school systems for 2 years, they've also been failed by the same system with everyone. So why do we have to deport them? How does that help the common good? But too many stayed quiet when around that. So, look, I accept fully and own absolutely that as a person who is now a politician, though I wasn't born one, it's very difficult to get the words right in the first instance. But after that, we have to be able to learn, apply, and do things differently, because we are literally talking about people's lives in some instances here.
David, can I? Yeah.
I see the point that there is a danger that people feel. There is a danger that people feel that any concerns about the lack of resources are being dismissed. And I genuinely, I suppose, just defensively following Gary's work and knowing the way I try to approach it, it would be very easy to just be finger waggy, and you can see that's what works on social media. And I see some politicians that just do. But there is a genuine attempt to differentiate between people who are feeling dislocated and people who are being flat out racist.
David, I want to bring you in because one of the points that you made was the rapid changing demographic migration boom in this country, and how our infrastructure, which kind of underbeds everything we're talking about here, is not keeping up. And you made an interesting proposal that you said a slower Irish economy would allow us to catch up, build the housing, provide the healthcare, and thus deal with this fracture that has emerged between communities when it comes to so-called outsiders coming in. So I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so maybe that's an unusual one for an economist to say. Do we need too much GDP? There is that thing around having one Mars bar and then you have two and then three, and you don't feel great after the fourth. And we have had an incredible run in the Irish economy for some time now. And I'm not the only one pointing this out. If you look at John Fitzgerald, wrote in the Irish Times this week, the economy has been running really hot. He's previously cited data that in 2023, about half of new hires in the Irish economy were to citizens other than Irish. So the economy, when it's this hot, has to rely on inward migration to fill roles. And yes, there are great challenges that I think can be overcome in bringing people in, but if you have slower growth in the first instance, that can be helpful. I think one route towards that, there's been so much focus with migration on IPAS and asylum, which is really not the main route for inward migration into at least the Republic of Ireland. That's mainly through work permits. And work permits have been on a real tear coming out of COVID. They've been hitting kind of 30,000 levels. Now, that doesn't mean 30,000 people come. It's, you have to get a visa and all of that afterwards. But what should be looked at, and it's being looked at, is the wage levels. So, part of the difficulty for integrating for a new arrival into the country is to be able to work your way up the wage ladder and be able to maybe move to a decent place where integration could be more amenable to you. So, particular sectors like healthcare, Gary mentioned that, our hospitals are really full of people who are doing diligent and brilliant work in healthcare. But the wage levels are quite low. So setting higher wage levels in those sectors could be a way of actually kind of taming the number, providing a better opportunity for those who do come, and may, in the round, provide a better all-rounded system.
I want to bring young people into this discussion because, as I said, this is all intertwined. But I feel a few of you mentioned to me before today about how young people's discontent, sense of disempowerment, is underlining many of these fractures. So, Claire, I might start with you with a northern perspective of how this young people feel perhaps that their futures are not leading anywhere because of the politics, as you said, the stop-start nature of the way that Northern Ireland is working, and what is the route out of that, I guess? Yeah,
I think it is fair to say. I mean, we talk a lot in the north about the brain drain, and that is very, very real. We export about a third of our students because we have this called the Mazen cap, an artificial restriction on the number of student places because we won't increase the funding. So a third of young people who want to go on to third level education have to leave. So we spend $250,000 on their primary and post-primary education, and then we send them to Dublin or to England. But there's a wider kind of reasonableness drain as well, which is people who feel very, very suffocated by the politics, that feel that it is sectarian, it's homophobic, it's racist, and they don't see themselves and they don't see their lives. And a lot of people, my age, friends of mine whose kids are, maybe early teens, saying, God, I'm going to have to tell them, go away and never come back because they find the politics so frustrating. Now, those of you who've been in the north, have been in Derry or Belfast, know it's class. It's got a lot of self-confidence at the moment. It's a great place to be. There are now kind of careers that you couldn't have dreamt of a couple of decades ago. One thing that I do have to say, and obviously this is my political perspective, I appreciate it isn't everybody's, we can't keep suffocating the New Ireland conversation either, because a lot of young people look fairly, jealously down in the south. They look at an open, dynamic economy. They look at progressive social change coming from the ground up. They look at a society that is accommodating difference in race. They look at an ethical foreign policy, and they say, yes, of course, I would like to be a part of that political entity. And we go, stop being sectarian. You're being sectarian if you have that conversation. Or, there is a sense from parts of the establishment in the Republic that effectively the North, we're all conflict actors to be managed within our borders, rather than people who have, lives and wants and aspirations for our future. And I think a lot of younger people do find that frustrating, that the New Ireland conversation is still being labelled as sectarian when it looks anything but to them.
Lata, you have brought up a family in Northern Ireland. How do you think you and your children see the opportunities that were available to them in Northern Ireland, and perhaps the change in milestones that David referred to, that everything is happening later, finding a house happens later, settling down, having a family? Do you think that changes how young people perceive the community that they live in within Northern Ireland?
That's... I have 3 grown-up children, all in their 20s. One of them's, my eldest, it's her birthday today. She's 27. And I've never thought negatively about Northern Ireland. I think it's the worst thing that any society can do to themselves, is think negatively about their own society. So I've never brought my children up to think that Northern Ireland isn't a great place to be. I've always felt that it's actually a fantastic place to be, and we have a great way of life. We have a great sense of humour. We have great art, creativity. We have some brilliant education. And when I hear, with respect, our politicians talking our society down, I'm thinking, what are you doing? Why are you not talking us up? We're a brilliant people. We have so much to offer our children. Why are you encouraging our children to think negatively about our society? What is that doing? That's weighing our children down, weighing them with anxiety, weighing them down with fear, weighing them down with a sense of no purpose. To build more and increase the brilliance of our people and our society. There is nothing better for me. I used to go to England, and I remember the Indians over in England. They used to call us the Paddy Indians because we came from Northern Ireland. And I'll tell you, we wore that badge with pride. We were more than happy to be Paddy Indians than bloody English Indians, let me tell you. And we were more than happy to be, when I look at what's happening in America and I see, oh God, J.D. Vance is married to an Indian. Oh dear God. Or some of the politicians during Brexit, the Bravermans and the Priti Patels, and I used to go, oh God, this is desperate. But I felt pride in Northern Ireland because this is my home. So I will not be putting my society down. You should not be putting our society down. None of you should be putting your society down. You should all be telling your children that this is a bloody good place to live in. And a lovely island. And I feel that, and this is how I feel, Claire, okay? I have watched and grown up with all of you. I have watched the politics of the Adams and the McGuinnesses and the Seamus Mallons and the John Humes and the Paisleys and the DUP and the UUP and the flippin' SDLP, friggin' Sinn Féin, the lot of yous. And none of you have a sense of great pride in who these people are that we have been lucky enough to grow up amongst. We are a great people. I am a new branch of your tree. I am neither green nor orange. I am a new branch growing up from the root of your tree. And I am taking more pride than some of you people on either side of this debate. And it breaks my heart that I have learnt to enjoy the best of both cultures. Both my Indian heritage, which I'm very proud of. My parents came to Northern Ireland 68 years ago. They could have cleared off when the trouble started, but they didn't. Their generation stayed. Their generation had invested in this people. Their generation started businesses with these people. They employed local people. My father never talked down this society. Never.
But do you see the legitimacy? Because I have deep pride. I love it. That's why I'm spending my life trying to make it a better. But is it not legitimate to say, I love it, but I don't think people should have to wait 4.5 years for an operation?
No, of course.
We should be funding the arts at 10% of what they are.
I agree with all of that.
But it's not saying it's a tool.
No, but you do.
I love
the media will take that, and they do that.
I don't think that's true. I am really positive. I am very prideful about it.
Claire, I've listened to you a long time, and I hear more negativity.
Okay, well,
I want to hear more positivity about what's great about our society.
I'm asked to talk about, say, well, fair enough, but is it not legitimate?
I want to jump in
is it
and
not
say,
legitimate to critique, say, for example, paramilitary control of communities, saying, I don't think that's good for society? I don't think that's talking it down. I think it's just...
I do want to jump in and say, as an Irish person, it's very difficult, and I'm a very proud Irish woman, to feel pride. Let's jump back to November 2023, when there were buses burning on O'Connell Street, to feel pride in being Irish on a day like that. And I think we are a wonderful, diverse, intelligent people, but there are moments when it's very difficult to see the light. Gary?
Yeah, and I think it's because you feel pride in your communities that you've been so fortunate to represent. Like, I can't walk into Dublin and say that we have a housing opportunity and actually that being legitimate. We have a housing crisis, and if I was to say anything other than that, I would actually be letting down the people that have voted me to represent them. And that's the job of representative democracy, which we live in. You have to represent the views of the people whose doors you've knocked at and heard their pain, heard their cries, and go out echo that. And if you're really fortunate, be able to make budgetary and legislative changes to improve their circumstances. But we can only do that by giving voice. And look, we do it because we feel proud. You know, for me, I'm absolutely proud of, love where I grew up, love this country, love the opportunities of it. But I'm absolutely dedicated to saying that actually potentially there is a better way. You know that, and that's why, like, I get up and I brush my teeth in the morning, I'm thinking about whatever I'm going in to give voice to that day. But that's what we do. Like, and I don't think across the political spectrum, you know, well, within reason, I disagree with Fine Gael on night and day, but that doesn't mean that I don't think they're decent people. I just think they have a different approach to the world than I would in terms. But like, that's just politics. There's a cut and trust to it, and it has to be testy. You know, it has to be exchanges, because what we are doing there is talking about how we build a republic that better reflects the one that can improve people's lives. So that's where I am in terms of young people and kind of empowering young people. I remember being here 12 years ago as a youth representative, which seems farcical to me now in MacGill, and I was actually reading the speech this morning. But the issues, you know, they're the same. It's housing, it's opportunity, it's what you're going to do. We are an educated generation, but what are you going to do with that? You know, and that's something that we have to be able to. Young people are, like, I don't think I'm going to be able to tell young people how to be empowered. I think you have to create the conditions by which that happens for them themselves and let them thrive. But we do know what's holding people back. Young people, all people, young people and old. It's the housing crisis. It's insidious to every layer of our society.
I want to finish up at the end of this talking about a few solutions to these fractures, but I would first like to open the floor to some questions, because we've had a very lively debate and I'm sure there are some thoughts. I'm going to echo Sarah Carey on last night and say, keep it brief. I don't want your life story. So, yeah. Okay, we'll take three. So the lady with the glasses, the man to my left here, and the lady in the front row. So the woman with the glasses is over there. She's about 5 or 6 rows back.
Hi, thank you, Anne McReynolds. Like you, Sorcha and Lata and Claire, I'm also a proud Irish woman who happened to be born and brought up in Ballymena. I don't know, it's a question to Claire and Lata mostly. In these fora where I enjoy coming together with friends and colleagues from across the island, I make it my business on every occasion to ask some kind of question from the floor, however banal and pedestrian, in order to right the imbalance that often happens with the lack of Northern Irish voices. I wonder if Claire and Lata feel the same way, and notwithstanding the comment last night and the deep cultural differences that exist between those of us who were reared in the 6 counties and the rest of the island, I'm I don't really litter very often, and I've never parked on a beach. But I do see a great big difference in self-confidence between my friends who are reared across the border, and that, notwithstanding what you're saying, Lata, the pride that we have is, I think, very different. Very, very different, and I think that Ireland is the original gangster fractured community. I think the issue is that we don't speak up, and I think it has got something to do with having been that self-confidence, having been bombed and shot and discriminated out of us. And that is not true of those over the border.
Thank you very much, and great question. Okay, it was the gentleman there, yep, thank you.
Just a point on housing. I think that we need to make more use of town centres. I worked in Dundalk, in the centre of Dundalk, in the early 70s for 3 years. And it was me and Belfast, Dublin Road was passing through it. Yet all the children and people were living in the centre of the town, and they were going to the national schools, the secondary schools, going to the sports facilities like snooker halls and cinemas and everything. And it was an integrated community. And I go back there now, like today, and you see the centre of the town and all the town vacant. And I mean, these houses all they have electric connections, you don't have to go to face judicial reviews. I mean, there's not something big for every town in Ireland to look at housing in the centre of towns and rejuvenate these houses that's there.
Thank you very much. And the lady in the front row.
I want to ask, this fracture in communities, is this a root cause really of is the root cause not a fracture in politics between the failure of politicians everywhere to address immigration, both legal and illegal, and the asylum system, which clearly needs reform? I objected to an IP centre near here successfully because I'm a time-rich, wealthy, well-educated woman who can look at the system and really write letters, do freedom of information requests, and get at the root cause of this political failure. And you don't need to scapegoat any of these communities. I'm not easily scapegoated, and so there's something going wrong in the whole discussion about assuming this is a problem at community level. This is a political issue it's being debated in the UK and across Europe. A failure of political leadership. The amount of elitist moral condescension that's going on from the centre. The stuff I read, I don't live here, but permanently, but I read so much and thought this is a political issue. And when I wrote it up, I wrote some very effective letters, and it stopped it. It stopped the IP centre. It stopped these greedy developers taking advantage of it, and stopped communities being fractured in the first place. So just focus on the root cause, I would say. Or can I ask you, can you not see that as the root cause? So this kind of sort of deflective, this is scapegoating in itself, deflecting the debate onto communities. And because I don't lack housing, I don't lack access. I'm angry about this failure of politics, as I think everyone should be.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Okay, I'd like to start with the lack of self-confidence question, and I'd put that out, Claire and Lata.
Self-confidence? Don't really know about that, to be honest. I think the self-confidence issue this is, I think, where it's different for me. Because growing up in Northern Ireland during that time, and learning about the people, and being in amongst them, I didn't feel a lack of confidence. I felt they were just embroiled in this situation, and they were seen as nothing else but a troubled society. And I think it's how other people look at us. It's not how we look at ourselves. So, is that a fair point to make, Anne? I don't feel a lack of confidence. I don't want anybody to look at the people across the water or across the border there and think that they don't have confidence. they do. It's the fact that they are not given that kind of emotional support from their own sort of political system. Our own political system does talk it does talk us down. And then they wonder why they erupt when they do, when something happens. If they're not listened to, this is what I mean. It's like, if you don't listen to the people, particularly our working class people, if you don't listen to them, and you just brush over and you start getting into all the politics and yes, of course, our politicians are there to do the housing and do that really practical stuff. But being a leader is also about being sensitive to the emotions of the society that they're also there to serve. And hear what their fears and their grievances are without judgment, so that you can win over the vast majority of the people who feel a grievance that could easily erupt into anger. But we can bring them away from that if you listen to them and are sensitive to their feelings. And you will see, when you reject, if you ignore that, they erupt with anger. And that gives people the wrong impression that we're not confident, because we are confident. It's just we don't like to be looked down on. We want people to understand that we do not have necessarily all those ways of communicating and all those technicalities about everything that you have to run in a government and in an office. That's not what we're thinking about. We're thinking about what concerns us, and not to be looked down on whenever we try to express it. So okay. I feel confident enough to say what I need to say to my politician. And I know when people who think like me may not be able to express it like me, when they're looked down by them, they erupt in anger. And right. you can't expect them to do anything unless you listen with real, and you understand fear, you understand cultural clashes, you understand they may not be able to express the fact that they believe in a democracy, okay, but they don't know how to express it.
Thanks, Lata. I'm going to bring Claire in as well, because we are low on time.
Thanks, Anne, for the question, and I agree with a lot of that. I think it has stalled a bit in all the Brexit fracturing, that's the word of the day. But I enjoyed the growth of the Northern Irish identity. I identify as Northern Irish as well as Irish, and a lot of people go, it's very partitionist of you, to have a regional identity. And I go, have you ever met anybody from Cork? That's exactly how. And I know, as somebody from Galway and married to a Dub, it's very natural to have that regional identity. And I love ours, and I think we've got, we're a cultural superpower at the moment, as you will well know, running on very low resources. And I think it is important, particularly as I say, as I look to the constitutional conversation, that we are very clear that we have got something to bring here. We are the home of the trade union movement on the island of Ireland, of the civil rights movement, of radical Presbyterianism, as kind of a fiery northern star is the phrase I'm using in terms of driving the things that need to be new in the new Ireland. And I think we should be confident about that. But you're right, because there is, I don't like to use the word othering, but I was in Galway, as I am a lot of the time, and I ran out of, counting the conversations I had in shops and oh yeah, running away from the bonfires. A lot of people, when they hear the accent, that's the first thing. And I know, again, my own in-laws in Dublin are, how are things up there? As if it was the moon that I live in, and not, my own in-laws had never been to Belfast until their son married a woman from Belfast. And it is very normal, and it is very normal to have that experience, and we do have to be confident about what we have to offer, and I suppose integrate and participate in the national life and national conversation in ways that isn't just our dysfunction. Housing in the city centre, you could not be more right. When I left Belfast City Council 10 years ago, the last motion I got passed was to have a playground so that families living in the city centre could maybe make a go of it. It has yet to be built. And in terms of, you're right about Mears, who are the provider of asylum accommodation in the UK, including in Northern Ireland, turned profit of tens of millions of pounds last year. So I am with you in terms of the rapacious corporates that are making money out of this, but that isn't the same. There are 1 billion people on the move at the moment in the world because of climate, because of conflict, because of, as we did for generations, looking for better opportunities. I understand definitely the challenges of managing and accommodating that movement, but there is a difference between saying somebody's making a lot of money out of this and saying I don't want, they look different to me. So there are legitimate reasons for people to say, we don't have GP places in this area. We're struggling for primary one places. There's nowhere for childcare. I can't get housing. There's a difference between that, and there are genuinely people who say, you're importing values that are inimical to ours. And I disagree with the latter argument.
David, I want to bring you in on the point of housing as well, because housing is something that underpins all the fractures that we have discussed, and it is the ongoing crisis that is on our airwaves every day. You again referenced in your points earlier that a slowing down would perhaps allow us to catch up, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on the point that was made regarding housing in town and city centres.
Yeah, so the town centres point, real vibrancy in towns will come when there's a lot of people in the towns, and many of our towns are structured that you've got a street and then you've a lot of 3-bed semis at the outskirts. That's why having more smaller apartment buildings in town centres, be they above the shop or any of that kind of style. And I know that's been said for the past decade, we need more of that. But I think the look again at apartment regulations could be a vehicle towards that. There's no shortage of money behind various schemes towards this that's out there, but the uptake isn't so great. But the other thing about vibrancy in town centres, the gentleman mentioned, was about people actually being in them, even if they live in the surrounds. And, a lot of young people don't come into town centres because they're all online. They're all on their phones. Gen Z is now reporting in a CSO data point we got this week, the lowest level of alcohol consumption weekly compared to the others. Now, look, that's not everything in the round, but it tells you that people aren't going out to the pubs. And every year the vintners are telling us, look, we've more pub closures. And I'm not saying everyone, go out there on the tear, but putting the phone down, getting back out, go to the cinema, in person. This is my first MacGill. And I watched this online on the live stream about a decade ago for the first time. It's so different being in person, and most of you in this room know that. So tell the young people in your lives there's actually a place to go in the town centre that is different to the internet. That would be my message.
Gary, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the fracture in politics being the issue rather than fracturing communities, and tying that into IPAS centres. And it also ties into a point that David made earlier, I think it was David, regarding the people who are coming here, that the vast majority of immigrants who come here are coming through legal pathways, seeking work, coming here to work, coming to work in our hospitals, our schools, and that it's a very small proportion that are going into IPAS centres.
Yeah, the population of people awaiting international protection is about 31,000 at the moment, and that's separate to the Ukrainian who are on the temporary protection directive. But in terms of outside of the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we have about 31,000 in our international protection system. Now, I also think the idea of confidence is actually something that applies here too, because we have a government. If we was asked to talk about dysfunctional government, it would have been a very different tone to the conversation, because the government have made decisions in relation to how the international protection issue and challenge, particularly after COVID, would have been met. And they chose to do it in a way that what they've always done since the foundation of the state: see poverty, see vulnerability, and see opportunity for someone else to make money, to monetise oppression. And that's what happened with the international protection system. And it didn't have to be that way. Catherine Day had a white paper on which asked for the state reception centres to be built. First was 6, and then in this updated paper she had 9 state reception centres. They've never been built because of government who lacked the confidence to actually go in and talk to the community that they may be presented with and say this is a state-run reception centre. So in the absence of that, we got this ridiculous, worst possible approach where it was basically putting a call out for anybody with vacant or empty buildings to come forward. And in that absence of leadership, we got the situation where misinformation was allowed to be presented. There was no proper communication strategy with communities. There was no effective outlaying of here's the information, here's how we're going to help support the community. That didn't happen. And in that void stepped in fear, mistrust, agitation, outlays of fear that manifests itself in ways that I wouldn't agree with, but I have to understand in order to try confront. And that was a failure of government. We are a country who understand the necessity of leaving because of oppression, because of economic opportunity elsewhere that doesn't exist here. Immigration, whether we like it or not, will be a factor for every generation that is of now and every generation that comes after us. It's how we respond to it that matters. And as a state, we have failed grossly, and it has led to both disconnection and discord within communities. But that is a failure of leadership, a failure of state And the only thing to do now is, how would we do it better? You know, we don't, like 31,000 people in our immigration system is not a challenge to a population of over 7 million across the entire island, obviously. But that is something that we have let almost define communities, and that's not the truth of these communities. These communities are really resilient. They've had to demonstrate resilience in ways that many of us can't possibly understand. But we allowed that failure of the state to step in to place vulnerable people in amongst other vulnerable people in some areas, not the same everywhere, and said, well, they're to blame for your poverty and oppression. And this is not only an issue in working class communities. I mean, I talked about the placard earlier, but I mean, you get judicial reviews in more affluent places against these same centres. So, look, it was an issue that the state failed upon, didn't act in accordance with best practice, and that left us in a position where we were.
I'm going to take a few more questions. I'll go further back in the room this time. So there's a lady in a black dress there. There is a man, yes, you there, and we'll take this lady up. Sorry, you're up front, but we'll take up front. So we'll start with this woman here on the inside. Yeah, if you want to stand up and introduce yourself.
Caroline Conroy from Dublin, former Lord Mayor of Dublin, 22 to 23. And it was just on the negativity that Lata was talking about, and our politicians who go down that route because it's populist. But when I was Lord Mayor, and I'm from Ballymun, the protests happened in Ballymun, and I was shocked and upset at what was being said and the amount of people that went out on the streets. So I gathered a meeting together in Ballymun with all the community groups that work at Ballymun, and we've had a history in Ballymun of always having people from all over the world living in our place, and it's always been harmonious. But what happened then that day when the protests happened, when we gathered all the community groups together, they were outraged what happened. Now, there was some politicians that just wanted to grab a microphone and get out there, or their megaphone, and start protesting against the protesters. But we didn't want to do that, because these are our neighbours, our friends. And we didn't want to call them out on something that they had heard, which was misinformation, which was the riling up of fear and hate against a group of people that had nothing to do with what was happening. So we decided we would have a meeting with as many people as possible, got a statement together with the correct information and myth busters, with all of the things that were being said with the correct information. We sent that around the community. The protest started with about 400. They went down to about 30 because people understood. When everybody signed that statement, politicians, elected or unelected, community groups, schools, principals, everybody signed that statement. And that meant that that was the correct information going out in the community. I hate to hear people... I hate hearing politicians saying that it's somebody else's job to do that. It's not. It's our job to do that. And if you're elected, it's your job to do that, to bring the correct information to your community. And just on I suppose, a political point to Gary there, saying to people that you're going to fight for housing, you're going to fight for this, you're going to fight for that, and then when you get the opportunity to go into government, you sit in the sidelines because you want to grow your party. You don't want to take that chance, like us as Greens did, and get wiped out at the next election. That's not what you're there for. That's not why you put your name on the ballot paper. You do it because you want to actually make change, and you know you can only make change when you get at the table.
Thanks for that point. I will give the panel a chance to respond, but I'm going to go to this man here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sorcha. My name is Aubrey McCarthy. I'm a newly elected senator. I will say what Gary has spoken about there, about the riots in Dublin and that. I run a homeless cafe in Pearse Street in Dublin, and we feed up to 500 a day there, and it's a delicate balance. We have asylum seekers, we have a lot of Irish people, and we've done this for over 20 years. But the number of asylum seekers has increased over the last maybe 2 to 3 years, and it's a gentle. We've managed a delicate balance that everybody gets on. We've bingo, we've singing, we have food, we have parties, and it all works well. But Justice Minister O'Callaghan announced during the week that there's a likely European Court ruling coming out in the next 2 weeks, which will mean that asylum seekers will be entitled to more than the homeless that are on the streets of Dublin. So what we have at the Lighthouse is a wonderful working initiative, and I'm worried that the perception, rightly or wrongly, will affect that balance. Thank you.
Thank you, Aubrey, and really appreciate that point about the Lighthouse. It's a great initiative. And we've got the final question up front here.
Thank you, Sorcha. I'm speaking as somebody who was a volunteer in rural East Galway. We had 150 Ukrainians placed in a former Redemptorist monastery, and they're gone now for over a year. But what strikes me from that whole experience, and seeing that the host family allowance has been reduced from 800 to 600, I actually think it should have been increased, because at the end of the day it results in better outcomes, not only for the Ukrainians but for the host family in mutual understanding and integration. And instead what is happening is that developers and hoteliers are profiting from the costs of hosting large groups of people together, which will never lead to integration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to start with the first point about the misinformation that creates fear and hate, and your creation of Mythbusters to bring around an understanding which brought down the number of people taking part in protests, but the onus shouldn't be on the community, it should be on politicians to do that. So I will bring that question to the politicians first, if that's okay. Claire or Gary, whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, but it absolutely is. But in the absence of, so when we talk about politicians, I mean, there are politicians who've taken advantage of the crisis to spread misinformation. There's other politicians that got stuck in and where it was difficult. That all happens, but it still doesn't happen without the people who were actually in government at the time creating the conditions by where the information can be given and stepping up. But I don't want to get too political on that. On the area of, like, I'm only in politics because I want to be in government. But I was in the room also with the Taoiseach who hadn't read our manifesto when we were actually about to go into a programme for government talks, and those deals were long since done with the independents. But someday we absolutely the only reason I'm in here is to make legislative changes and policy changes. But the state has a responsibility to inform the citizens of the country about what's happening, how it's happening. That doesn't mean anybody deserves a veto, far from it, but bringing vulnerable people in the middle of the night into buildings that have just been opened up, that left all of our jobs more difficult. But within that, I think most of us got stuck in and applied the best that we could. On the area of the Justice Minister's comments last week, I think the Justice Minister is very quick to take to the radio and the airwaves when there's something to do with immigration or deportations. I thought his comments last week are interesting. He's a member of the government. If there's legislative lacunas or issues, I mean, he should seek to bring forward changes to that rather than trying to whip up fear or misinformation, because again, that makes all of our jobs more difficult.
Thank you, Gary. Claire, Hanna?
Yeah, just on the opposition thing, I agree with you. You do have to go in. We are currently in opposition because we didn't get enough votes to be in government. We announced it quickly in what I call our "you can't fire us, we quit" move, which was just an attempt to get ahead of it. But I agree with you. You run for election in order to get your hands on the levers of power and change things. I also want to just stand the ground on challenging violent racism in case the narrative develops that, you know, you're not being understanding enough. There is a difference between, and I know again after the race riots in Sandy Row, 3 days later, I had a leaflet round the doors in Sandy Row and a clinic organised. Last week, I got a lot of brickbats thrown whenever I spoke out against an asbestos bonfire in the constituency in the village, and I didn't think that was a good idea, that I was just attacking loyalist culture. We have a leaflet out yesterday for a clinic next week. You know, we are here to listen and to engage with people on the ground, and certainly for myself and my party, we won't shy away from that. And I think you can do both things. You can oppose violent racism and also understand the pain of communities. Speaking about the Ukrainian support, and a couple of years ago in the north we had the Syrian relocation scheme. And actually, it's a really good proof of concept that actually when you do put support services around people, and when you do say, you know, you can work and you can do X, Y, and Z, those people are now living good lives, able to contribute, able to, you know, properly integrate. When we talk about integration, that is made much more difficult if you're sent to a hotel on the edge of town or in the back arse of nowhere. You know, if we're talking about integration, you shouldn't lock people away in an administrative system and in some accommodation far away. You should facilitate them to do that as soon as possible.
Lata, I know you wanted to comment on this as well.
I wanted to say, isn't it interesting that of the 400 people that were out protesting, only 30 remained. That says a lot to me. When people are informed, then you know you can pull them back from the brink of falling into that very hard right kind of ideology. But I also wanted to talk about, just very quickly, is the solutions to these kinds of issues, because democracy is a very important part of this discussion as well. When we talk about cultural clashes, democracy is something that is, to me, the most important and the most proud thing that I feel about being born and raised in a democracy. And I think one of the fears that people have is there are going to be cultural clashes. But I was brought up to believe that no matter what religion, ethnicity, race, culture you may come from, nothing eclipses, nothing surpasses democracy. And as a minority culture and a minority ethnic group, we were encouraged to integrate into the principles of democracy. So my father was very much about women's rights. My mother was a very feisty woman who took no prisoners from anybody, and plenty of the men in our community knew that. They used to call her Mrs. Thatcher. But she was a much nicer version. And so I think we have to talk about solutions about what it means to be in Southern Ireland, where there was normal politics and ethnic communities could get involved, whether we have our abnormal politics in Northern Ireland, and you have to be very conscious as an ethnic minority how you get involved in green and orange issues, because you cannot be seen to be taking the side of one and becoming the enemy of the other, because that was one thing I was taught we were supposed to help bridge the gap between the local communities who were fighting as well. Then you talk about things like having the guts to talk about things that don't fit into the culture of democracy. So you can't fear those things, and you must not fear saying what you feel out of fear of being called a racist. Because I've spoken to so many people, and I make a point of communicating with just regular people who I talk to every day, and all I get out of them is, oh God, Lata, I couldn't say that because I'd be scared of being called a racist. And I'm like going, well, are you a racist? And they go, no. I said, well then stop it. I said, because what you're doing is your silence. You're being intimidated to be quiet. You're being intimidated to fear an opinion. You mustn't fear having an opinion. We can debate that opinion and we can find a way to live together. But we cannot fear challenging someone who has a cultural practice, that, say, for example, that goes against the rights embedded in the laws of our society. We cannot let that happen, because we either all get treated equally under the law and under democracy, and we don't have these institutions or services that are being culturally sensitive. Yes, be culturally sensitive about what someone eats. Be culturally sensitive about, little things. But when it comes to the principles of our society, which has fought for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, with lots of kings and queens' heads getting chopped off and all sorts of other things, and state and religion being separated, we can't afford to let anyone's culture or anyone's religion surpass or eclipse the principles of democracy. That is integration. That is what integration is. Not, oh, well, I'll eat your food and you eat mine. That's all lovely and pretty. But that is not the fundamentals of what integration is. Integration is we all follow the same principles of the democratic culture which we live in today. And that is where I come from.
Thank you, Lata. And finally, David, staying with that, the concept of solutions. As Lata's proposed, a democracy that recognises all the diversity that exists on this island. how do you foresee the fractures that we have discussed today moving forward in the coming from an economic point of view, and perhaps when policymakers are making their decision over the next few years?
Yeah, well, it's great that democracy has held up in Ireland relative to other places in the world. I mentioned about wages as being a theme that I think is going to become more emergent in the coming years. So wage growth is something that we've become quite fearful of, given that it tends to go hand in hand with inflation. But there's a story I tell about the 1950s, that house prices in the 1950s were flat, but wages went up 71%. And it meant that housing that was once very expensive and many people rented during those prior decades was then affordable and was then accessible for young people. So when people come out with slogans, I can lower the price of housing, that's not the right one to focus on. Raise the wages, and that might make a difference.
We are coming to the end of our time, so I'm not going to take any more questions, I'm sorry. But I wanted to thank our panellists for their time today, for their contributions, and for a very interesting and lively discussion. And thank you to the audience for joining us.